Thank you, Kevin. It's a pleasure to talk to you and the listeners today about my favorite desert animal, the roadrunner. I titled this presentation Almost Human because, as we will see as we go through, there are a lot of behaviors on the part of the roadrunners, some of their habits that are very similar to our own. And it makes it easy to remember those and maybe helps us associate with the roadrunner a little bit more. Um, I should start off the presentation by giving you an idea of just how well known the roadrunner is. I call it America's best known bird. In 1992, I was invited by the Defenders of Wildlife to the hearings over the Desert Protection Act, which was being proposed at that time. And um, we were busy with congressional representatives during the morning, but in the afternoon we were free and were able to walk about Washington, D.C. as however we saw fit. I took the opportunity to take a picture of a roadrunner and our bald eagle, the national bird, down the street, and I would accost people on the street and show them the two pictures and ask them if they could identify either one. What happened was that I found out that the roadrunner is actually better known than the bald eagle. There were 38 people interviewed, and I only chose people that appeared to live and work in Washington, D.C. You know, they had briefcases, and they were walking hurriedly to one appointment or another. And I got them to stop. Not everybody stopped, I should mention that. And in the end, I talked to 38 people, and here were the results. 12 correctly identified the bird on the right as the bald eagle, but 20 people correctly identified the roadrunner. And it was from this informal survey that I drew the conclusion that the roadrunner was perhaps the best known bird in America. Now, roadrunners are known for a lot of other things too. Their running ability, they can run up to 18 miles an hour, which is pretty good for an animal their size. They are also known to be a killer of venomous snakes. And of course, the cartoon has made them particularly well known. And I'll talk about all these things as we go through here this morning. I should point out that the cartoon has some problems. First of all, it shows this particular roadrunner with just 3 toes. Roadrunners actually have 4 toes. It also shows a green tail. Roadrunner's tail is essentially dark or blackish in color with maybe a few blue or purple highlights when the sun's hitting it directly. And of course, the top knot is not purple, but dark as well. So the cartoon only has a scant resemblance to roadrunners. Nevertheless, I do think it's helped promote the roadrunner as a very well-known bird. That beak, by the way, is yellow, and the roadrunner's beak is charcoal in color. Now, humans seem to like roadrunners. They often use roadrunners in advertisements, such as this mobile home park, Roadrunner Realty that you see here, Roadrunner draperies, mini blinds, and vertical blinds. People use the name Roadrunner all the time because it is such a well-known bird that people have a lot of positive feelings about. This has been true not just in historical times, but in prehistorical times as well. This is an Indian rock art site that a photograph taken of a roadrunner petroglyph in the McCoy Mountains of extreme eastern California. And if you look carefully, you can see that the petroglyph has features that the roadrunner does. The long bill, the head crest at the top there, the long tail, and the X-shaped foot, which we'll talk about in just a second. Here's another petroglyph. This one's in New Mexico in the Chihuahuan Desert, but it has those same features again, the head crest, long bill, X-shaped arrangement of the 4 toes, and the long tail. There really aren't other birds that have all these features, and so when you see a petroglyph like this, I think it's a very safe assumption that it is, in fact, a roadrunner. One of my favorite stories is that the Hopi, well known for their Kachina dolls, actually have a roadrunner Kachina doll, yet no roadrunner lives within 150 miles of the nearest Hopi dwelling. And so here we have a Native American group using roadrunners in their Kachina dolls, and yet they don't even live near roadrunners. So roadrunners' reputation extends well beyond their natural distribution. We next need to talk about just what is a roadrunner, what makes it different from other birds. And there are several features. Now, I should mention that the roadrunner is obviously a bird, and because it's a bird, it is a descendant of the dinosaurs. So sometimes, if you want to think about roadrunners and their habits, they're very similar to the feeding habits of a lot of small dinosaurs that existed so long ago. But they are direct relatives. With regard to a little bit more refined categorization, the roadrunner, in spite of its odd behavior, is not cuckoo, but it is in the cuckoo family, Cuculidae, a bird family that has some other birds you might know. Now, the cuckoo family is most closely related to parrots. Like roadrunners, parrots also have two toes pointing backwards and two forward. They have that same toe arrangement, which not always, but in this case does indicate fairly close relationships. Besides the roadrunner, there are some other members of the cuckoo family that live in North America that you may be aware of: the group-billed Annie and the yellow-billed cuckoo. Again, similar toe arrangements, and the tail is long and the beak is down curved. All these are features of members of the cuckoo family. Now, if you're wondering, is there just one kind of roadrunner? The answer is no. There are two species of roadrunner: the lesser roadrunner, and then in the United States, the greater roadrunner. The difference is that the lesser roadrunner is about 2/3 the size of the greater roadrunner, and so it's somewhat less. It lives in southern, central, and almost in northern Mexico. And there is a place in Sonora, Mexico, where the two species ranges overlap. And so they could theoretically encounter each other. Because the greater roadrunner is larger, I suspect that it would be the more dominant should they ever run into each other out in the wild someplace. So there are two species, the lesser and the greater roadrunner. Now, during the Ice Age, based on fossil evidence, there lived a roadrunner that was much larger than the roadrunner that we see today in the United States. Here's an image just to give you an idea of the relative size. Well, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit. The roadrunner in the Pleistocene epoch was about 50% larger than the roadrunner today, based on the few fossils that have been found. One of the interesting things about roadrunners is that their distribution is expanding today. And it's expanding in spite of use of toxic chemicals, habitat degradation of a variety of kinds, and global warming. Roadrunner's range is actually expanding both to the north and to the east, as shown in the arrows on that map. It's likely that the roadrunner will actually benefit from global warming and will expand its range northward and eastward even further. There's a lot of reasons for this. Certainly warmer temperatures and a drying of the western United States will open up the habitat, and at least more habitat will be opened up. And roadrunners like open habitat without a lot of brush and trees. They do best in open sunlit environments. And so that's one reason. To the east, what's happened is that the forests have been cut down. And as the forests have been cut down, making way for golf courses, shopping malls, and the like, roadrunners have been able to move eastward into these new open habitats that have been created by human activity. Now, some of the features of roadrunners that it's good to remember, and these are impressive-looking terms that you can use to impress people at the next party. You can talk about zygodactylous feet. Roadrunners have two toes pointing forward and two backwards, as I mentioned before. Here you can see the tracks of the roadrunner, which are quite distinctive. Although flickers might land on the ground and leave an X-shaped track, their track is much, much smaller than that of the roadrunner. So if you see an X-shaped track on the ground, it's most likely to be that of the roadrunner. Roadrunners are quite cooperative. They usually respond in a positive way to humans, and this particular roadrunner was attracted to the wash where we were doing a research project on the birds. and we swept the wash with brooms and then got the roadrunner to walk over the swept area so we could get good photographs of its tracks. One of the nice things about working with roadrunners, as you'll see, is that they are very accommodating in regards to people. Here's this roadrunner actually is holding up his foot so you can see those two toes pointing forward and two backward. It's interesting to note that when they first hatch out of the egg, 3 of the toes point forward and only 1 backwards, and then the toe arrangement changes as the young roadrunner develops in the nest. And when they leave the nest, they have that X-shaped track pattern and the zygodactylous feet that you see here. This roadrunner is not a tame one that's showing me his foot. He had stepped in an ant mound and he was picking ants off with his beak. That's why he held his foot up like that so we could see it. And there's a close-up of the feet. Distinctive tracks, and one of the features of members of the cuckoo family. Now, in addition to the zygodactylous feet, the roadrunners also have very long tails and head crests, which the tail, at least, is a common feature among cuckoos, and a lot of cuckoos also have head crests. Take a look at those. You can see that tail is long, about as long as the body, and the roadrunner uses that tail as a rudder to help it turn on a dime when it's running fast, and then also helps brake it a little bit when it is gliding. And I'll talk more about its flying ability in just a second. So long tail is a feature. Here's another word that you can use to impress your friends with, the postorbital patch. This is the featherless patch right behind the eye of the roadrunner. And I believe you can see my pointer here. This is the postorbital patch, which in the roadrunner is colored orange, white, and blue, which adds quite a bit of color to an otherwise somber colored bird. And we'll talk about that because the postorbital patch generally is a good indicator of the emotional state of the roadrunner. Normally, feathers are relaxed and they cover that postorbital patch, but when the roadrunner is aroused, those feathers separate, exposing the colors for a variety of behavioral features of this bird. Now, I think the best comparison I can make is that we have a lot of facial muscles which help show our emotional state at any given time, whether we're sad or happy or angry, whatever the case might be. Roadrunners don't have those facial muscles, but they do have the postorbital patch. So the roadrunner exposes that patch as its emotional state changes. When it's highly aggressive, it really exposes that patch, making sure that all the colors are seen. And at those points in time, usually it's attacking a territorial invader, usually another roadrunner. What I like to say is that it's an indication, don't mess with me. I can tell you an interesting little story about, let me go back here for a second, a little story about the roadrunner. We once spent $400 to stuff a roadrunner that had been killed by a car, and we wanted to examine some of the behavioral characteristics of the roadrunner. So we took the stuffed roadrunner out into an area that we knew was occupied by both a male and a female. And we were curious to see what the roadrunner would do when confronted with an invader, in this case a stuffed roadrunner, in its habitat. Now, mind you, we spent several $100s getting this roadrunner ready for the experiments. When we put it in the environment, and we didn't make sure that the postorbital patch was fully exposed in the mounted or stuffed specimen. And when we put it out there, our several $100 stuffed animal was destroyed within 15 seconds by both the male and the female roadrunner that occupy the territory. That particular experiment didn't last very long because we weren't willing to spend more money to stuff another roadrunner. But it does show you that those colors are a sign of aggression. And if one roadrunner enters the territory of another pair, it will definitely be attacked viciously by both the male and female that already occupy a territory. So roadrunners are very territorial. Another feature of roadrunners are their short, rounded wings. I always say roadrunners would rather run than fly, and that's true. Here's the wing of a roadrunner, which might look not particularly short, but if you compare it with birds that are well-known flyers, like the albatross wing, you can see that for its size, the roadrunner has short wings indeed. I get a lot of questions about the flying ability of roadrunners, and roadrunners can fly, but their flight capability is very, very limited. Normally, what they do is they glide, maybe from one shrub to the ground or across a small ravine. They can flap their wings for a moment, but they cannot maintain sustained flight for more than 15 seconds. One time we did an experiment where we took a roadrunner up in an airplane 5,000 feet above the earth, and then we let it fly out of the plane. And for about 15 seconds, it was able to glide, but then its pectoral muscles are so small that the wings folded upward and the roadrunner fell to its death. Now, if you believe that story, you may want to buy some land in Florida because we never actually did that experiment. But had we done the experiment, a roadrunner would surely drop to the ground like a stone if it were let out that high off the earth. So the longest we ever saw a roadrunner flight was in Big Bend National Park, and we actually timed it because it jumped off a cliff and glided about 700 feet to a plateau below, and that flight lasted 14 seconds. And it was gliding the entire way. It never flapped its wings. And that's probably about the limit for a roadrunner. If you put a roadrunner on the ground and then put some kind of bait on a platform 12 feet above the ground, the roadrunner cannot reach the platform by jumping and flapping its wings straight up. It would have to be able to find another elevated perch and then glide over to the platform to get the food item. We actually did that experiment, and what we found was that roadrunners are smart enough to know that if there's a mouse, in this case we were using a live mouse, and it wanted to get to the platform, they knew they had to run up to the side of a wash bed that was at the same level as the platform, and then they, with a little bit of flapping and some gliding, flew over the platform, snapped up the mouse, and then landed in the wash bottom below. So they can't go straight up, but they can glide for a short distance. I want to show you this picture now. This is the skeleton of a pigeon. You can see the keel bone there. That's a massive structure, and that's because pigeons have very large pectoral muscles, flight muscles, and those muscles are attached to that keel, and that's why pigeons are such renowned flyers, very strong flyers. But if we look at the skeleton of a roadrunner, the keel bone is almost non-existent. So their ability to flap their wings for very long is extraordinarily limited. They truly would rather run than fly, and they just don't have the muscular structure to fly any distance at all. Now, like humans, roadrunners have an amazing array of vocalizations. Our species is very good at imitating other animals and other voices. Roadrunners don't have that kind of array of vocalizations, but they do have make a wide variety of sounds. One of the greatest variety of sounds in the avian world, I would argue. Of course, the bill clicking is what's probably best known, but they also make a mating call. I'm going to imitate it for you now over the microphone, so listen carefully. It goes like this. Ooh, 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 ooh. That is the call usually made by the male. We believe some females sometimes may make that call too, but normally it's made by the male, and it does that to advertise its territory. And That call, if it's a lone male and it makes that call, it will attract a non-mated female into its territory, maybe sometimes a mated female, but we're not sure about that. But it will attract a female into its territory for the purposes of getting together as a pair. And when roadrunners mate, based on the best evidence available, it appears that roadrunners mate for life. They're monogamous. There's not a lot of evidence on that, but the 4 instances that I know about indicate that they do stay paired from 1 year to the next and only find a new mate if their mate is dies for some reason, hit by a car, or captured by a Cooper's hawk, something like that. So that's the call of the roadrunner, and then they also have the bill clattering. The bill clattering is used to let their mate know their geographical location, where they are in relation to each other. They don't normally hunt together, but the bill clattering kind of gives the other roadrunner, either the male or the female, a rough idea of where its mate may be at any given time. That seems to be the primary function of the bill clattering. Now, one of the interesting things about roadrunners, and why I call them the ambassador of the Southwest, is that of all the wild animals I can think of, roadrunners seem to be the most accepting of human presence. And I'm going to show you some slides that indicate this. And I should mention before I show you these slides that roadrunners often follow people because, like cattle, people are large, and as we move through the environment, hiking, strolling along, we stir up a lot of insects, and roadrunners sometimes follow people in the hopes that the person will stir up a grasshopper or some other insect that they'll eat. And for that reason, people sometimes think that the roadrunner is very fond of them as the roadrunner follows them down a trail somewhere in one of the national parks. They're very accepting of humans. Now, these photographs are all of what are technically wild roadrunners that have learned that if they hang around people, people inevitably do what people do. We're social, so we often share our food with other members of our species and sometimes other species as well, as you can see here. Now, this lady is got the roadrunner to come up onto her porch every day, and she would feed it hamburger. And hamburger is a horrible thing to give roadrunners. They will eat it, but if a parent roadrunner feeds one hamburger meal to its offspring, that can result in bone deformities about 50% of the time, a single meal, because the young roadrunner is developing very rapidly, and hamburger is not a complete meal, not even close. All of us would die if we ate nothing but hamburger. And the same is true for a roadrunner. And for a developing young roadrunner in the nest, this can spell doom. Usually when roadrunners have bone deformities, the deformity occurs in the leg. And if you're a roadrunner with a bad leg, you're a dead roadrunner. So please never feed roadrunners hamburger. If somebody insists on feeding the local roadrunners, go down to Big Five or one of the pet stores and buy some mealworms. That's closer to a completely balanced meal than hamburger would ever be. I had one lady once tell me that, oh, well, I didn't feed it hamburger, I fed it filet mignon, which technically is even worse. So they just don't have all the amino acids young roadrunners need for proper development. This is the lady that fed filet mignon to the roadrunner. They will eat it, but if they feed it to their young, the young are in big trouble. Single meal can cause bone deformities. This is a photograph taken in one of my neighbor's home. Each morning, he would open up the front and back doors to let some fresh air, and he would leave them open for a good hour. And roadrunners are predators. They're curious. They're always looking for food. And this roadrunner came right into his house while he was sitting in his office. And it did this every single day, and it would come into the house, and it would look for crickets, God forbid a cockroach, go in all the bedrooms looking for an insect meal, and then would come into his office, and you can see here it's sitting on his computer printer. And this is how accepting roadrunners are of humans. They have most of the time positive experiences with humans, and they take advantage of it. So these are all wild birds, technically. Uh, one of the problems we had in our experiments is we wanted to get a lot of pictures of roadrunners doing a variety of behaviors. And in this case, we were doing feeding experiments. And the biggest problem we had in terms of getting photographs of our experimental subjects was keeping them far enough away so that we could get a picture. They would always move in very, very close. Always curious, always hoping that we'll stir up an insect or two. My favorite picture, I laid down on my back, and the female roadrunner jumped up on top of me to see if there was any food I was going to scare up. We curiously, the females seem a little more accepting of people than males do. Males are a little bit more aloof, uh, which brings up the question: how do you tell the difference between a male and a female roadrunner? You can't. Um, the only real sure way of doing it is if you see them mating, and the male would be on top and the female on the bottom, but only after March 1st. In February, when hormone levels are fluctuating wildly, the female actually may mount the male. So it's not until March 1st that it will always be the male on the top when mating is taking place. Other than that, there's no real way. Males are slightly larger, but we could never really see any size difference when we were working with them in the field. This is a tennis tournament that takes place in the Palm Springs, Coachella Valley area each year. And one of my most memorable moments at the tennis tournament was when the 6'4" Boris Becker was frightened by a roadrunner that had flown onto the court. And he was quite scared of the bird. The bird was moving towards him because he was moving around, and it was hoping that he might scare up a sphinx moth, which were very common around the edges of the tennis court during the tournament. The roadrunner is not dangerous in spite of what that label says. Like humans, the roadrunner is an omnivore with a propensity for a diet rich in meat. Um, roadrunners will eat anything that moves, any animal that they can subdue and swallow whole. This is so that's almost any arthropod. This one's eating a tarantula. Now, when they attack and kill a tarantula, they pull all the legs off first and then swallow the torso and the cephalothorax all together. So as long as they can swallow it whole, they will attack almost any animal. This is a roadrunner. This is part of our feeding experiments. In this case, the roadrunner's bill has some mealworms in it that came from us, but we noticed that in this picture that it also had a scorpion that had found somewhere in the wash where we were working. Roadrunners will eat scorpions, and they swallow them whole after they kill them by mashing them a bit in their bill. Here's a roadrunner with a desert iguana. Large desert iguanas are usually too big for a roadrunner to handle, but as you can see in this picture, there are exceptions to that rule. I don't know that it could swallow this lizard whole. We have observed on occasion when roadrunners are dealing with fairly large prey animals that they were able to kill, they sometimes will start grabbing its limbs, wings, feet, whatever the case might be, and beating the animal on the ground, hoping to remove a leg or tail or something like that. We have a first-hand account of a northern mockingbird that was attacked and killed by a roadrunner. Normally, we wouldn't have thought that the roadrunner could swallow a mockingbird whole, but it thrashed the mockingbird about so often and so intensely that it was able to get the wings off and the feet off, and then somehow or another it got the torso of the mockingbird down its throat. Very unusual. I don't think that happens very often, but it shows you the tenacity with which they'll go after certain prey items if they're hungry. Roadrunners are notorious for eating snakes, and almost any snake will do, but roadrunners behave as though all snake species are venomous. So they do everything they can to not be bitten by a snake, whether it's harmless or not. And this is probably one of their favorite foods because it's fairly easy for them to kill snakes by prey beating. That is, they pick it up in their mandible, usually by the head, and then beat it against the ground repeatedly until they've broken the snake's vertebral column in several places, effectively paralyzing the snake. And then they swallow it a bit at a time. You'll often see roadrunners running around with a snake trailing out of its mouth. It takes about 15 minutes to start digesting the snake enough so that it can swallow another few inches, and it may take up to 2 hours for the roadrunner to finally get the entire snake in its gullet. Here's a roadrunner that is attacking a small red diamond rattlesnake, and the roadrunner has leaped into the ground to avoid the fangs. Roadrunners are not immune to the venom of a rattlesnake. If the rattlesnake were fortunate enough to bite them, from the rattlesnake's perspective, the roadrunner would die. But we have seen roadrunners feed on rattlesnakes over a dozen times now, and in no case did the roadrunner even come close to being bitten by the rattlesnake. They're so fast and so predictive of the rattlesnake's behavior that they can avoid the lethal fangs fairly easily. When they are battling a rattlesnake, though, they're very cautious. They approach it with their wings outstretched. They are trying to elicit the rattlesnake to strike. And I'll show you a picture in just a second what happens. This small sidewinder rattlesnake, by the way, rattlesnake has to be less than 18 inches in length to be killed and eaten by a roadrunner. They may attack a larger rattlesnake, somewhat larger than 18 inches in length, but large rattlesnakes they leave alone. There's a limit to the size of rattlesnake they can eat. And sidewinders are a very favorite venomous serpent prey item because sidewinder rattlesnakes are rarely over 18 inches in length. So they're a very favorite food. First, the roadrunner puts its wings outstretched, hoping to get the rattlesnake to strike at the wing feathers. If that doesn't work, it will kick at the rattlesnake, trying to get the rattlesnake to strike, because striking is critical. If a rattlesnake buries its head in its coils and doesn't strike, the roadrunner will eventually abandon its attack. And we have seen rattlesnakes avoid being killed by burying their head in the middle of their coils. But normally it's a propensity of a rattlesnake to strike. And when they do that, the roadrunner waits until it can grab the upper jaw of the snake. And then it holds on to that, and it starts beating the prey over and over again on the ground until its vertebral column is broken in many places and paralyzed. Here's another roadrunner with a rattlesnake, grabs it on the upper jaw and holds it that way so that it cannot be bitten, and then pummels it over and over. We x-rayed one of these rattlesnakes that was killed by a roadrunner, and we counted 18 fractures of the vertebral column in the rattlesnake after being beaten to death by a roadrunner. And once the rattlesnake is dead and lifeless, keep in mind it might actually only be fully paralyzed, but once that happens, the roadrunner then carries it off, either to consume it in a safe place or to feed it to its young. Now, like humans, roadrunners have some enemies. Not the coyote. Regardless of what the cartoon may tell you, roadrunners are not normally preyed on by coyotes. That's not to say that a coyote wouldn't eat a roadrunner carcass if it found it on the road. But roadrunners are too fast and too elusive to normally be captured by a coyote. So regardless of what the cartoon says, the coyote is not an important predator. Important predators are aerial predators, and this is a roadrunner looking up in the sky because above it was a Cooper's hawk. Roadrunners are in my experience, I would argue that the Cooper's hawk is the most important predator of roadrunners. This is a juvenile Cooper's hawk on a chain link fence, and this was in an area where we had been monitoring a pair of roadrunners and their offspring for several weeks. Um, and there were Cooper's hawks in the area. This was near an establishment in Palm Desert, California called the Living Desert, some of you may know about. They regularly have Cooper's hawks that hunt in and around the Living Desert, and this juvenile was one of the ones doing that. Now, normally, roadrunners avoid predation by Cooper's hawks by hiding under dense shrubs and small trees, and that's usually an effective way to do that. But if a roadrunner sees the Cooper's hawk, they become extremely bold. Uh, my favorite story about this is one that was taking place in a wash by the Living Desert. And the adult roadrunners saw the Cooper's hawks flying overhead, so they ran right out into the middle of the wash, fully exposed. And the Cooper's hawks, this particular one that you see here, juvenile, immediately dive bombed the roadrunner, which then ran under the Palo Verde tree and hid from the hawk. The hawk then flew up into a cottonwood tree and perched there. Roadrunner ran back out into the wash, exposing itself again. The Cooper's hawk tried again to capture the roadrunner, and the roadrunner ran once more under the Palo Verde tree. This happened several times. Eventually, the Cooper's hawk got so frustrated it tried to run down the roadrunner, but that was not going to happen. The roadrunner, once on the ground, the roadrunner got within 3 feet of the Cooper's hawk. The Cooper's hawk would lunge for the roadrunner, which then easily outran it. And we watched this Cooper's hawk chase the roadrunner around and around the Palo Verde tree several times on a fairly warm morning. Eventually, the Cooper's hawk got exhausted, was panting profusely. The roadrunner came right back to it, tried to lure it into a chase again. And so roadrunners are, once they know a Cooper's hawk's in the area and they see it, they toy with it. And we saw this not just on the occasion that you see in this picture, but in many instances. There's the roadrunner in the middle of the wash looking up, waiting for the Cooper's hawk to make another futile dive at it. What was really interesting was that eventually the Cooper's hawk flew down the wash, gave up trying to capture the roadrunner, and the roadrunner was running down the wash after the Cooper's hawk, apparently wanting to play more of the game. In this area, I mentioned the chain link fence, and one of the smarter young roadrunners that came out of the nest, and this is one of them. He found that if he stood on top of the chain link fence, he could see the male and female, his mother and father, roadrunner, bring back prey to the nest before his nestmates did. And they actually were all out of the nest at this time, but he was the only one that would jump on a fairly high perch so that he could see the parents coming and get the food before his siblings did. It worked good for a few days, but eventually the exposure of this young, inexperienced roadrunner led to its demise when this Cooper's hawk actually snared it off the top of the chain link fence, carried it away into a cottonwood tree where here you can't see the roadrunner anymore. It's covering it with its wings, but it then ripped apart the young roadrunner. So adult roadrunners are aware of the dangers of a Cooper's hawk and how to deal with them, but young roadrunners are not. And in some areas, at least, we speculate that probably most young roadrunners don't even reach 1 year of age because they're killed by a Cooper's hawk in the area. Now, like humans, at least in theory, roadrunners pair for life. And again, as I said in my earlier comments, the evidence we have to date indicates that roadrunners do select a mate and stay with that mate, not unlike a lot of birds of prey. And so it's not uncommon to see two roadrunners together, a male and a female, particularly in the morning when they haven't gone out on their foraging trips. And it's a lot of, as you can see here, they're hard to tell apart. But we have found subtle differences in behavior. Usually the male seems a little more aggressive. And if you're lucky enough to see them mating, of course, then anytime after March 1st, then you can tell which one is the male. And there, once you see that, there's usually some kind of identifying characteristic, maybe a funny spot on one of their legs, or maybe there's a small piece broken out of a mandible, something that will help you from then on distinguish the male from the female in a mated pair. Here they are again. Um, Humans, we're attracted to roadrunners. We when we hear that an animal is monogamous, we kind of identify it with it a little more closely, perhaps because that's what humans are supposed to be. Uh, but in any case, you will see them together in the morning. Now, like humans, females demand gifts from the males before pairing with them. And it's really interesting because it has to be a very important gift. Sometimes male roadrunners will approach a female with nesting material, but that's not a good enough gift to get any female at any time during their paired behavior to mate with the male. She requires a good gift. Uh, Insects are usually not acceptable either. Um, like humans, roadrunners require about 20 kinds of amino acids, the number found only in vertebrate prey. So that'd be lizards, snakes, mice, other birds. They have all the amino acids necessary. So, in my experience and in the experience of most others, the only suitable gift that the male can give a female in order to instigate mating is a vertebrate animal. And I have never seen any exceptions to that in my experience, and I don't recall ever reading about anybody else having an exception either. It's certainly possible, but doesn't appear to be likely. Um, so the reason for this, the evolutionary reason for this, is that the females that hold out for a completely balanced meal, if you will, are the ones that are more likely to mate with males and pass on their genes into the next generation than females that would accept an insect. Uh, Young roadrunners cannot usually survive on a diet of only insects. And so the female, by uh, requiring that vertebrate prey, she makes sure that she gets a male that's capable of bringing back food that will result in the greatest number of offspring developing into young roadrunners eventually successfully leaving the nest. Now, here's roadrunners mating, and this is a common scene in the springtime when they normally breed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about their breeding season because it varies depending on where you are in the Southwest. But the male mounts the female. Their cloacal openings come together just for a couple of seconds, and he inseminates her during that process. And you can see here the male, it has, in this case, a kangaroo rat that it has captured, and it holds on to that. He only gives it to her after mating happens. And then once mating has occurred, she immediately reaches up and grabs the meal from him, and the consummation of the relationship is completed at that point. Now, what's really interesting is that if you go to the Sonoran Desert or the Chihuahuan Desert, we find that roadrunners breed not just in spring but through the summer, because in those deserts there's a summer rainy season when productivity uh, uh, becomes very high again. There's a lot of food, and roadrunners will have 1, 2, 3, 4 broods, up to 6 broods from spring through summer in years of abundant rainfall and when prey is abundant. Um, what's interesting is that in those areas, the male offers something like a kangaroo rat to the female to instigate mating. But after spring into summer, when they have been mating and having several broods, pretty soon, when the female reaches up to grab the gift that started the mating process, he won't give it to her. In fact, he hops off her back and runs away with the food item that he saves for himself. Um, we have never seen that in California, but you see that in Arizona in midsummer all the time. And so the frustrated female becomes very angry, and she chases the male for sometimes over 100 yards, trying to get him to drop the food item that she feels is rightfully hers. Um, so after they've been together for a long time, the romance wears down, and the females stop getting the gift. I don't want to draw any analogies with our species, but maybe you can. Um, so, as with humans, the thrill of intimacy wanes with time. Uh, we have roadrunners in our area in Southern California, where I live. They breed once, sometimes twice, but usually not more than 2 times. Whereas in Arizona and the Tucson area and in Big Bend National Park, they will breed from spring right through summer. And there have been some broods that have fledged even in September. So their breeding season is much, much longer in those desert regions that receive summer rainfall. Now, the normal clutch size of a roadrunner is, about 5 eggs, as you see here. We have seen nests with as few as 4 eggs, and I think the record, as I recall, is 11. Um, Regardless of the number of eggs in the nest, though, we have never seen, nor have we heard from other researchers, ever a roadrunner that has actually been successful in fledging more than 4 young. There's a reason for that. Now, roadrunners normally seem to prefer to make their nests in arborescent cacti. That being said, we found nests inside garages, on shelves, in oleander bushes, mesquite trees, a variety of areas. But most of the nests that we encounter in the Sonoran and Mojave Desert, where you have some arborescent cholla cactus, would be in these cacti. So when I'm looking for a roadrunner nest, I always go to these large cacti first, the branching chollas. Here's one. This is a golden cholla, Cylindropuntia carpa for those taking notes. And if you look carefully, you can see there's the female roadrunner right in there. These have quite a bit of shade, and that's one of the requirements of nest site location, is there has to be shade most of the day so that the eggs don't overheat. In fact, the adult, if there is not complete shade, the adult roadrunner will shelter the eggs from the direct rays of the sun on hot days. Now and here they are. Here's the baby roadrunners, the hatchlings. Let's put a date on that. There's the far one on the right, just hatched within the last 24 hours. Then you see the one that's 2 days old, the one that's 4 days old, and the one that's 5 days old. Roadrunners have asynchronous hatching. That is to say that all the eggs don't hatch about the same time like it would, for example, a house finch would. So asynchronous hatching is a problem, but only if you're the runt of the litter, so to speak. So the last to hatch is more likely than not to be devoured by one of its larger siblings. And that's one of the ways that roadrunner populations are controlled. Better to have a couple of roadrunners survive and get fed enough and fledge than to have all of them starve to death. So inevitably, this one right over here, the hatchling, inevitably that younger one is devoured by one of its larger siblings. And in all the nests that I've examined over 150 nests now, that always has happened, where the runt of the litter, if there's more than 3, is devoured by one of its older siblings. There's some question as to whether the sibling actually attacks the smallest roadrunner and devours it that way, or if one of the parents feeds the runt to the oldest one. Better to have a few survive than none, though. And so, as horrible as this may seem to our species, in fact, it's quite adaptive to roadrunners. In a year when there's a lot of food available, up to 4 roadrunners will be fledged. We've never seen more than that, and I don't think I've ever heard of anybody who's told me they've seen more than 4. Typically, though, 2 to 3 seem to be the norm, at least in California where I live. Here's mom and dad on the nest. If you look carefully at beneath what I believe in this case was the male, there's one of the young roadrunners there, and the cholla cactus. Yes, occasionally young roadrunners will become impaled on cactus spines and die. I've only found that one time, but I have heard other people tell me they found that as well. Generally speaking, what happens is the parents uh, bite off and break off the spines immediately around the nest to reduce the likelihood that a young will become impaled on one of the spines. Here's an adult roadrunner feeding one of the chicks, a zebra-tailed lizard. And if you're impressed with the photograph, it's not quite as lucky as it might look, because roadrunners, when they're feeding the young, they put the morsel in the mouth and they hold this position for up to 2 minutes. And during that time, an adult roadrunner will be transferring fluid from the adult into the young to provide the moisture that it requires for proper growth and development. Lizards are mostly water, but some insects are a lot less water, and this transfer of fluid may ensure that the roadrunner stays well hydrated. So this didn't happen in an instant. It happened over about a 2 minute period, making it easier to get photographs like that. One of the fascinating things we found over the years is that uh, roadrunners, when they leave the nest, they'll actually weigh more than the parent in most instances, and are about as large as the parent visually too. Um, and what we have found is that the male roadrunner will feed young that have left the nest for about 24 hours for one day after they leave the nest. The female will continue feeding the young roadrunners for up to 2 weeks after they've left the nest. In my family, this was repeated with regard to my siblings. My mother was more willing to allow us to stay at home longer than my dad wanted us to be at home. So, and Roadrunner females seem they have a greater investment, so I understand their willingness to keep feeding the young. The young here is begging for food from its mother. And here she is feeding the. In this picture, you can see the young actually appears to be heavier than the adult that's being fed. And they'll continue begging for food for up to 2 weeks. We have found that after about 2 weeks, the parents start acting in a hostile manner around the young, eventually driving them from the parents' territory. Um, and that's simply because the territory only has enough food throughout the entire year for one pair of roadrunners, not one pair and their up to four offspring. So young are driven from the territory by the parents beginning about 2 weeks after they've left the nest. And they're expected to go out and find their own territory. They're very vulnerable at that time, and that's another period of high mortality for young roadrunners, is that period of time when they're searching for their own territory. One way you can tell adults from juvenile roadrunners is adults have a yellow eye ring. I don't know if you can see that. Let me go back. Uh, and the young have all dark eyes. They don't have that yellow eye ring yet. They develop the yellow eye ring at 4 months, as I recall. Now, here's the development of roadrunners. These two chicks are about 12 days of age. Notice there's an egg in this nest. God forbid that egg hatch, because I can promise you that any young roadrunner that's 12 days younger than its siblings will definitely be devoured by them, either being fed by a parent or devoured by the young themselves. Here we are, 13 days old. They're starting to develop some color in that postorbital patch. Here at 15 days of age, they usually haven't left the nest at this point. This was one of the many roadrunners that we have raised. We're often brought eggs by gardeners who accidentally disturb a nest in a shrub or tree, The parents abandon the nest, and the eggs are there, and they bring us the eggs, and we hatch them in the incubator. And so this one is walking around, but they wouldn't normally be out of the nest at 15 days of age, so it's a little misleading, the picture. Here at 18 days of age, and at this point, they will be leaving the nest. They'll stay in the area of the nest, but they no longer spend time there. Now, one of the reasons we got interested in roadrunners and started studying them was that we noticed ourselves, and also from anecdotal information given to us by other people, that around mid-November, roadrunners start to disappear. Around my house, I have never seen a roadrunner after November 15th. And we have found that's more or less true for other people too, who knew the local roadrunners, often because they fed them, but knew the roadrunners, knew the behavior, and they would disappear in mid-November, and they wouldn't see them again until the early spring. And so one of the most frequent questions was asked of me is, where do the roadrunners go? And as you see here on this this slide, that observations were declining in some areas by 90%. And then around February 15th, observations began increasing again with the reappearance of the same individual birds. Now, you might say, if you haven't banded the roadrunners, how do you know they're the same birds that were there and disappeared in the fall? It's because one of the benefits of having some people who have roadrunners habituated to being fed by them is that they have unique behaviors. For example, one lady had a pair of roadrunners that in the morning would come to her back slider and start tapping on the slider with their beaks. She would open the slider, they would run in the house, they'd get on top of the kitchen drain board, and she would feed them. I got her to start feeding them mealworms instead of hamburger, which was an improvement, to say the least. And they would do that regularly. Then they would disappear in mid-November, and then they would appear again in the spring and start tapping on the slider once again to gain entrance and be fed. This behavior is not something that roadrunners are born with. It's a learned behavior. And so the fact that they repeated that behavior indicated that it's very, very likely that those were the same birds that had disappeared in the fall. And I can't tell you how many times I've had people tell me this, many, many dozens of times. So where do roadrunners go? What happens to them in the fall when we start seeing fewer and fewer roadrunners? Which I'm not saying that we never see roadrunners after the middle of November, just that their observations decline in almost all areas that we have studied and all areas where I've talked to other people familiar with the avifauna of where they live. Now, roadrunners, as I've already said, aren't good flyers, so they're not flying to Mexico or someplace in the southern latitude for the winter, and we know they don't run from as far north as southern Nevada all the way to Mexico to spend the winter. So this is a real issue, a real question. A little bit of background on roadrunners before we look at this question in more detail. Roadrunners enter torpor every night. That is to say, they lower their body temperature from 10 to almost 30 degrees at night to save energy. Remember, for every 10 degrees drop in temperature, the metabolic rate is cut in half. So a roadrunner that allows its body temperature to drop 10 degrees at night only requires half as much energy or food energy during that time period. So there's a great advantage to becoming lethargic, entering torpor every evening. It saves energy, reduces your requirement for food. That would be true whether it's us or roadrunners. It would be the same. Roadrunners then in the morning, instead of burning more calories to generate more body heat and to get their body temperature up to around 102 degrees Fahrenheit, they bask in the sun and allow the sun to warm their bodies rather than burning up food energy, again, to save on the need for having to forage so much. Of course, in the wintertime, when reptiles are pretty hard to find and insects are much rarer than they would be in spring, for example, Saving energy has a lot of advantages, and we suspect that what's happening is that roadrunners, instead of just going in torpor for one night, stay in torpor for 1, 2, 3, several days, maybe even a few weeks, uh, going into hibernation to reduce the need for food and to survive through the relatively lean winter months. We think that some roadrunners may very well go into hibernation for at least short periods, um, if not several months. But we have a problem, and that is that no one has ever found a hibernating roadrunner before. As an aside, I might mention that the skin on the back of a roadrunner is black instead of light pink as it is on most other birds. And that dark color absorbs about 25% more energy from the sun than the whitish skin of most birds. So that dark skin is part of this whole uh, warming up, uh, metabolic metabolic warming in the morning, and that dark skin helps utilize the sun even more than it would be true for other bird species. Uh, so, what if a roadrunner stayed in torpor for an entire day, week, or even months? Now, the challenge would be to find a secluded shelter where they would be safe from predators because remember, roadrunners are in torpor, so they do not have the ability to move rapidly to escape a predator. They're very vulnerable. So if they're going to do this, they have to find a very safe retreat. Uh, Now, there's only one bird in the world definitely known to hibernate, and that's the common poorwill that you see here, related to the whippoorwill. Common poorwills do not find a secluded retreat in which to hibernate because of their camouflage coloration. They can just fall asleep and go into torpor, go into hibernation right out in the open on the ground. And it's impossible to find them there. Uh, so we have two things to consider. We know that birds as a group can hibernate because we have at least one example known to hibernate, the common poorwill. Um, and we know that roadrunners do go into torpor every night. So we're not taking a huge physiological jump. They simply extend that nightly torpor to several days or several weeks, an ability that we know can be done by the poorwill. So, do the question that I've had, and I have not been able to answer yet, do roadrunners hibernate? We, in the beginning of our study on roadrunners, we acquired little transmitters like the one you see here, and our goal was to put one on the back of a roadrunner and then locate it in January, our coldest month. And if we found a roadrunner in torpor during the day in January, that would be very powerful evidence to indicate that roadrunners do in fact hibernate, and being only the second bird in the world known to do that. To date, we have been unable to get a transmitter on a roadrunner in the fall and relocate it in the winter. And we spent 2 years trying to do that. At the time we were pursuing that study, the battery life of transmitters was just about 10 weeks. So we had to get the battery on the Roadrunner in mid-fall. And at that time, Roadrunners, it's very difficult to trap Roadrunners in live traps so that you can put that transmitter on them. And so after a 2-year period, we abandoned that and went ahead and worked on another project. But this is fertile research for anyone else who might want to attempt to do this. Now, hibernation research is critically important to humans. You may know someone who had an elaborate surgical procedure that was required, and in order to have enough time to do that procedure, the doctors lowered the blood temperature of the human patient. And that reduced the metabolic rate of the human, extending the amount of time for intricate surgery by sometimes hours. Um, So that's one value of hibernation research. One of the problems with hibernation research is that hibernation in mammals is always interrupted about every 10 days by what we call an awakening, a spontaneous awakening. Even though that's a tremendous energetic cost for the mammal, all mammals that are known to hibernate awaken about every 10 days. And we're not sure why they have to do that. So hibernation studies in birds would be interesting because if birds don't awaken, then their physiological strategy for hibernation might have even more utility for humans. And of course, the other value of hibernation research is that someday, not in my lifetime, that's for sure, when the Earth becomes uninhabitable, the only way humans could possibly reach a planet that was conducive to life as we find it here on Earth would be to be put into hibernation for long periods of time as we travel to a distant galaxy, a distant solar system, where there would be a planet that would be habitable by humans. Right now, the only conceivable way that could happen would be to put people into hibernation. So hibernation research has incredible value, and the fact that our ambassador of the Desert Southwest, the Roadrunner, has the capacity to show us the way, if you will, is very exciting. And perhaps in the near future, someone will actually find that Roadrunner hibernating on a winter day sometime around noon or the early afternoon. And that ends the presentation. I hope I've stimulated your curiosity about Roadrunners, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Okay, Jim. This is Kevin again. There is an observation and a question. One of my colleagues has seen a Roadrunner perched on the top of the peak of their roof, and she was wondering what that behavior pattern is.
Okay. Generally speaking, you will see a Roadrunner perched on a high object, a tree, or the top of a roof in the springtime, early spring, and that's when males are advertising their territory. They want to make sure if they have a mate, they want to make sure that no other Roadrunner enters their territory, and they can better see that from the perch. Typically from that perch, they'll make that cooing sound that I imitated a while back. But that's a territorial observation post, and if they don't have a mate, then they stand up there hoping that they'll either be seen or heard by an available female.
Great. From Marilyn Lutz, we have the question, did you discuss anting in Roadrunners? A-N-T-I-N-G?
Panting?
It's written down as anting, A-N-T-I-N-G.
I bet she means panting.
Okay.
Roadrunners, technically speaking, panting, as we think of in dogs, is physiologically different than what appears to be panting in Roadrunners and other birds. In birds, we call it gular fluttering. They open their mouth, they expose their moist respiratory surfaces to the dry air, and as water evaporates from those respiratory surfaces, it carries away excess heat. So that's how Roadrunners keep cool. We keep cool by sweating. Roadrunners don't have that ability, so they have to gular flutter, or you can call it panting if it's more convenient to do that. And right now, where I live, it's been pretty warm, and Roadrunners are usually seen panting through the midday hours when it's very hot. Of course, the risk of panting is that when an animal is panting, they're losing moisture, and the risk is that they might dehydrate. Fortunately for Roadrunners, as long as they have enough food, because their food is mostly water, they get all the moisture they require. They don't require drinking water. Not to say that they won't drink, just that they don't require drinking water as long as they have enough food. Most all animals are at least 68% water by weight. So as long as you have enough insects, mice, snakes, and whatnot to eat, they're going to get all the water they need, and then they can get away with panting.
Okay, well, actually, Marilyn clarified the statement. Anting, where the roadrunner spreads their wings over an anthill and
Oh, oh,
hunkers
oh.
down on the ground.
Yeah. Uh, that roadrunners are interesting because they have this behavior where they stretch out their wings and fan out their tail feathers and then lay down on the ground uh, without moving for sometimes several minutes. It's a very bizarre behavior. Some people believe that they were laying down in ant mounds and that somehow the ants would pull off ectoparasites that the roadrunners might have, lice or something like that. Um, I can certainly say that when I've seen roadrunners do that, they weren't doing it over ant mounds or lines of ants. So I'm quite skeptical that roadrunners would purposely lay down on a mound of ants. That being said, there are a lot of people that have told me that they've seen them lay down on ant lines of ants or ant mounds, and they thought maybe they were getting some benefit from that. Most ants have stingers, and they'll sting roadrunners. So I doubt that that's any kind of normal behavior. So what is the purpose of laying down on the ground there? Some people believe they're putting their body against the dry earth, and that dry earth can dehydrate eggs of ectoparasites. That's one possible explanation. But the precise explanation is not well known and has not been studied yet. They usually do it alone, not when there are other roadrunners or their mate is around. So it doesn't seem to have any role in, territorial displays, breeding behavior, anything like that.
Okay, and we have one more question from a resident of 29 Palms.
Okay.
How can we attract roadrunners to a yard in 29 Palms?
Okay. I now with the caveat that the National Park Service does neither allows nor promotes the feeding of wildlife in national parks. And I want to make sure that everyone is aware of that. And there's a lot of reasons for that. You don't want wildlife becoming dependent upon humans for their food, and you don't want wildlife approaching humans, particularly humans not familiar with animals. We had one of the roadrunners that I raised was very frequently was encountering people and was quite calm around people. And one day it ran over to the lady across the street who didn't know we had live roadrunners in the backyard. And it approached her hoping to be fed, and she hit it with a broom and broke its wing. So, with that in mind, if you want to have roadrunners in your yard, and they're good to have in your yard, they eat cockroaches, garden snails, black widows, scorpions, small rattlesnakes. I sure like having roadrunners in my yard, if for no other reason than what they eat. If you put in a lot of native plant species, you have some water bowls out, a lot of shade plants, and then some dense plants that roadrunners might even nest in. We have a pyracantha bush on the side of my house, and the roadrunners nest in that pyracantha bush not every year, but every so often. Those are all the basic things you can do. If you want to develop a relationship with a roadrunner that lives in and around your yard, your property, feeding it will get it to come around on a regular basis. I told you about people that regularly fed mealworms to roadrunners, and the roadrunners would knock on the door, so to speak, and come inside their house. And this is a very common thing. They may defecate in your house too, so keep that in mind. The best thing to feed them, and the most convenient thing, is to get mealworms at a pet store or at a place like Big Five. Mealworms are often used as bait. They're fairly easy to maintain and keep in a garage if it doesn't get too hot in the summer. And mealworms are pretty healthy diet for adult roadrunners and aren't too bad even for young roadrunners. So I had a friend, I used to teach a class at the University of California, Riverside Extension, and I had a friend who would allow me to bring all my students over to his home during the class. They would all sit on his back patio, and he would call the roadrunners. They'd immediately run off from the golf course onto his patio where the students were. He'd give all the students mealworms they would hold in their hand, and the roadrunner would jump on the lap of each student and go down the line of students in their chairs eating the mealworms held out in the hand. So it's they do respond to that. Remember though that if you are gone, and if you're feeding roadrunners, then you suddenly disappear, they may not be able to get enough food. So there's a lot of drawbacks with that. But if you're at home all the time and you don't go away on vacation and you feel you can religiously do that, it doesn't bother me in your own yard. It's good to have roadrunners around. They eat black widows. I've seen them pick off black widows right off the web. So something to keep in mind, and maybe enjoy wildlife even more.
Well, Jim, thank you very much for being here today. And I want to thank our audience. This afternoon's webinar will be with Sean Milanovich on the topic of Jim Pine of Serrano Kika and his neighbors at the Oasis of Mara. Until then, please stay safe and healthy. Thank you.